Jerry Yudelson, President of Green Building Initiative, a position I took over a little over 100 days ago. After 15 years of involvement with LEED and the U.S. Green Building Council, I'm now heading an organization that has an alternative green building certification system called Green Globes, which actually traces heritage to BREEAM in the UK, the original green building rating system about 20 years ago. I'd like to take the discussion down a few levels from the broadest global issues and philosophical issues to talk about green building software as it affects this broader sustainability conversation. And there we go. So you know, if you're going to talk about something and you want to offer some solutions, you always have to say, well, what's the problem? So I came up with this problem statement that most people think they'll be doing more and more green work as the years go along. But there's a lot of challenge of integrating markets, rating systems, and software tools that are stalling the level of green building uptake. And I'll show you some numbers which may startle you in terms of how much uptake there is. So what's the bigger issue? Well, I like to say the bigger issue, it's kind of like adult sex. You get the idea. So performance counts in all of these areas. And in terms of energy and the sort of global climate change picture, the problem we have is that we're not reaching the levels of performance that we need to have at all very quickly. And this is one chart that shows you at the lower kind of orange circle at the lower right is sort of the primary energy consumption goals for buildings in the U.S. is about 80,000 BTUs a year per square foot, and in terms of kilowatt hours per square meter, it's about 3 times that. The red curves and the green curve are the U.S. Annual Energy Outlook from a couple years ago. It's an annual publication of the Department of Energy, and it shows what they expect the trends to be on energy use in buildings. The top one is business as usual, the second line is integrated codes, and the third is what they call best available technology. And the point here is that even using best available technology, we're not going to reach our 2030 energy use goals with the current system. So we really have to think about how do we innovate. Wait a second here. Okay. So now the question is, well, here's what I'm going to talk about. Where we've been, where we are, where we need to get to, and a little bit of a vision for 2020. So where we've been the last 20 years, in the UK, they came up with a green building rating system called BREEAM. Stands for Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method. So this is the first one in the world. LEED was developed in roughly 2000. Leadership in Energy and Environmental Development from the U.S. Green Building Council. Green Globes itself derived from BREEAM and was the first to use online web-based software for assessing green building outcomes. It's about 10 years old now. And last year, the federal GSA, General Services Administration, put LEED and Green Globes on the same footing for federal projects. And then I took over the job to see if we couldn't make Green Globes something different than what I call now the best kept secret in green building. So LEED is the dominant one, many of you have heard of it, but this is an equal assessment system that has real legs to it. This, by the way, has a technology focus. That picture is the Cooper Union building by Tom Main, the architect in New York City. So if you're ever down in Lower Manhattan, go take a look at it. It's pretty dramatic. Well, where we're at in 2014 is there's about 85 billion square feet of non-residential buildings in the U.S. After 15 to 20 years of hard work, we've certified, according to any green standard from the lightest to the deepest green, 2.5 billion square feet, round numbers, in the U.S. 2.5 billion square feet is a great achievement. It represents about 20,000 buildings. But if you look at it compared to what we need to do, which is really to make the entire building stock, which in commercial buildings accounts for 20% of U.S. energy use, make it all much better, much more efficient, much greener, we've barely scratched the surface. So you would have to say that the current system for rating and assessing green buildings is not working. If after 15 years of hard work you only get to 3% of the market, you'd have to say why. And my conclusion is that the rating tools are needlessly complicated, that they are complex and costly. They don't provide a value add for the cost in the viewpoint of the people who sign the front of the check. And I like to say the people who sign the front of the check are the decision makers. We all like to sign the back, right? Pay to the order of me. But the people who sign the front of the check have decided in their collective wisdom that these tools are too costly for the value added. And so my conclusion, building owners are not buying it. Part of the challenge for the people in this room and for people in the software industry in general is, can we make a difference in this value versus cost equation? Because back at the ranch, as they used to say in all the Westerns, meanwhile, something else is happening that most of the green building world has not really taken into account, and that is the ongoing and rapidly moving seamless integration of real estate, IT, energy efficiency, and sustainability. If you actually look at, say, well, we've certified 20,000 buildings as green, there are somewhere in excess of 40,000 commercial buildings in the US that are already using energy dashboards, platforms, cloud-based systems for assessing their energy and water use, et cetera. So we're not calling those green buildings, but in fact, they are already using advanced software tools to manage for sustainable outcomes. So somehow there ought to be a way, in my thinking, to bring those two worlds together. So where do we need to be? Well, if you just take a target date 2 years out, that's not very far. We need design software that shows broader outcomes of products, including their health outcomes, their global environmental impacts, life cycle assessment, et cetera. That development is fairly well underway, but not yet at all complete. We need operation software focused on key performance indicators such as waste management, energy use, water use, purchasing policies, et cetera. That development is also fairly well underway. But we need rating systems that are integrated with operation software. And just as an example, if you take the LEED rating system, and by the way, I'm a LEED fellow and a professional engineer, so I've been engaged with this for 15 years. The LEED rating system was designed by architects for office buildings. It's now morphed into, as of the 2015 edition, into 21 different rating systems. But it's all started with a model of we're going to decide what's best for people, and then we're going to sell it to them. It's kind of a push model, if you will. What we really need is a pull model where we go to the most responsible operators and we say, what do you consider best for you? And then design our rating systems accordingly. That's my view of the world. We've gone as far as we can go with the idea that an NGO is going to tell the marketplace what's best for it. We really ought to be listening to the marketplace of responsible operators and saying, how can I take your key performance indicators, create a rating system from it, create an assessment model that you will then value enough to pay for? And that's the big challenge ahead. We need sustainable choices, obviously built into design software. So whether it's Revit or other models, we need to know that when I make a design decision, I have my sustainable outcomes right in front of me. So I don't have to be going back and forth between two totally different systems, because the design world will always gravitate towards what's efficient for design and we'll forget the rest. And we need low cost to certify. So our model at Green Building Initiative is that we use the ISO 9000, ISO 14001 model of an independent assessor who works with somebody throughout the process, then steps back at the end to give an assessment according to an established system. So the lead model is basically the assessor. No one at the organization ever talks to the project proponent until they submit their documentation, and then give sort of the Roman Colosseum thumbs up or thumbs down about it. So there's no dialogue, there's no ongoing learning, and I think that model is not going to work in the long run. What's the 2020 vision? certainly in the world of sustainability, sustainable building operations, is that carbon is going to dominate design. We need radical energy cuts. In his opening remarks, Paul talked about the push towards net zero energy buildings, which produce as much energy on an ongoing basis as they consume on every year. That really only works for 1- and 2-story buildings. It's fortunate, however, that that's the great bulk of buildings in the U.S. Half of the U.S. buildings are under 50,000 square feet, and most of those are 1 or 2 stories. If you think, or 3 stories at most, you think university buildings, primary and secondary education buildings, you think a lot of government buildings, you think most office buildings, 2 to 3 stories, you think most retail and commercial space, warehouses, etc. You begin to see that you got enough rooftop area in those lower rise buildings, apartments, to power them on an annual basis in most of the U.S. So that development has real legs to it and will continue to grow. Sustainability ratings need to be derived from software, not the other way around. In other words, if I have an energy dashboard, or which is now fairly complete, energy, water, waste, scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions, purchasing outcomes, anything that's a quantity, can be measured over time, can be put on a dashboard, have real-time data using cloud-based software. All of that should then yield the sustainable outcome. I shouldn't have to upload data to a separate rating system. And if you think about it, all of these platforms now can display an Energy Star score, which is a relative measure of how you're performing versus the bulk of buildings in your category. They can already do that. Why can't they then display a LEED outcome, a Green Globes outcome, and then when you want it assessed, you call in an assessor, a third party, to give you an actual rating. Meanwhile, you have all the data for operations on an ongoing basis. If you make a change in purchasing policy, you could see immediately the sustainability outcome in terms of an established rating system. That gives you good information for decision making. And if you're the sustainability director in any kind of organization, you've got to report up the chain, how are we doing this year versus last year? It's always going to be about continuous improvement. We need to make sure that all those tools are well integrated. And finally, we need full carbon accounting. Even in the US, Energy Star is just a relative scale. It says I'm less bad than 75% of all the buildings in my category in the US, right? I'm in the top 25%. When engineers design buildings today, they compare their outcomes to a mythological base building that meets an ASHRAE criteria for mechanical engineers, right? It's still a relative improvement. But now that this is baseball season, I can say with confidence for many of you, nature bats last. Nature gets to decide what's the right measure, and for nature, it's how much carbon is in the atmosphere, or how much greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere. That's the ultimate decision maker. So we need to start pushing full carbon accounting in design and operations, which means that we need to have those results. So I would rather see, instead of BTUs a year per square foot, which engineers love as a measure, doesn't tell you anything about carbon, we should be doing what a lot of Japanese do, what a lot of Europeans do now. It's kilograms per square foot of carbon. We need to get full carbon accounting, and so software needs to produce that as well. That's what I got to say. Thank you very much. And I think I did it. I think I did it in 12 minutes. So we have time for questions.
Yeah, I'm not real strong in the building industry, but so educate me. In your last slide, you talked about a full accounting carbon report, or what have you. Does that include, when you view energy, does it include electrical consumption? So for example, if I have a hypothetical building that has no crude oil or natural gas in the form of its energy needs, it only is all, quote, all electric for heating and ventilation, everything it needs is electric. Now you could at one point say it's zero carbon because we're not consuming any natural gas. However, it's consuming a tremendous amount of electricity, but then you have to ask, well, how much of that was produced by nuclear? Or if in the case of Portland, Oregon, it could be hydroelectric. So how much truly is the carbon really reflected, or is it a not fictitious, but it is an inferred number that may be a little fictitious, but depending upon the carbon blend that was producing the electricity?
Yeah, so the average office building in the U.S. is about 70% of its energy from electricity. So you do have to go back, and all those numbers are published by EPA. They're regionalized, so you can get a pretty good number. You also have to consider, as a few European projects that I've researched for books have done, you have to also look at the embodied life cycle energy of all the building materials. So that is, it turns out that as we screw down or diminish the envelope and system loads, we make systems more efficient, envelopes more efficient, that the so-called plug loads, everything that we plug in, and lighting loads come to dominate. So in commercial office buildings, lighting and plug loads are not heating and cooling, not ventilation, not elevators, are half of the use. And as you continue to push those down, you begin to find that the embodied energy of building materials over their life cycle becomes more and more significant. So some European buildings that I've looked at in my research have shown that 20% is sort of hardcore embodied energy, and the other 80% is all these other things, even in the most efficient buildings. So it does make a case for full carbon accounting, including thinking about, well, maybe we should start building more wooden tall buildings, using wood as a structural material instead of steel and concrete, because that may have a much more positive life cycle cost than steel and concrete, right? So the big change is going on in the building industry now, but everyone is beginning to think in those ways.
We're going to take it back here first.
Okay? Gentleman back.
Jerry, an anecdotal point as an architect, Alan Partridge, Group 2 architect from Alberta. Anecdotal point and I think a profound point. Anecdotally, LEED is flawed because, quite frankly, practicing in northern Alberta, in order to get LEED credit 8.1 daylight, I have to blow my energy credits because it's cold up there. And so it's fundamentally flawed. It's a system that was designed for a very narrow area. So I'm glad to hear that you acknowledge that. The profound question is, I don't think we've addressed the kind of elephant in the room when it comes to carbon, and that is the human resource. We have a world where the human resource is diminishing. You know, we're not meeting our 2.5 where we have 2 so that they can breed, and 0.5 is sacrificial. We're considerably less. Countries are going to hang on to their human resource. So why aren't we beginning to erode away at the notion of how much human energy? We're carbon ourselves. A lot of us have carbon in us. Why aren't we? And some of us have more than our fair share of carbon. I'll agree. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering why we aren't looking at this kind of broader picture of, and it might address things such as integrated project delivery, the change in the industry around the notion of getting away from the status quo of how we put buildings together so that we can use these resources correctly. Is there something in your initiative that you're looking at that begins to say, what credit are you going to give where you actually use less human carbon in order to put the building together? Because that is something that will profoundly change the notion of the industry that puts these buildings together.
Well, it would be a very interesting development to actually give negative points in a rating system for buildings that exceeded a certain threshold of cost per square foot or per square meter. Because you can do a LEED Platinum building, a 4 Green Globes building at $700 a square foot, but it's much better to do one at $100 a square foot, right? Or 150 or 200. So we haven't really faced that issue as well. But, you know, you can do daylighting in Canada. You just need triple glazed windows and all other kinds of things. It does work.
So Robert Anderson with Nemetschek Vectorworks. Your last slide talked about a definitive carbon budget being for building operations and for building design. But the actual construction itself of the building, meaning the sourcing of materials, how far they have to be transported to the site. You did mention the embodied carbon in the building materials, but also the energy involved in the construction process all play into that full carbon accounting. And this brings into question the concept that we have common in the building industry of value engineering. You know, late in the process, after a building has been designed, a contractor says, well, I can save X dollars per square foot by substituting this material for that. And it has to be shipped from Chile, but who cares? You know, and so this is until you have a comprehensive carbon pricing built into building materials, it's going to be really difficult to get that full carbon accounting understanding in the life cycle of the building. It's just really a comment. I don't think there's any quick answers. You might have some.
So you know, the rating systems do account for transportation, energy use, and sourcing of materials, but not very well. Yeah. There was a
Yes.
gentleman here, yes.
Yeah, Adrian Georgi. So thank you for the presentation. As far as I know, for sustainable development, there is a Dow Jones Index for Sustainable Development. Are these construction building industries part of this Dow Jones Index?
Not directly, but there is an actual movement called the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which now includes 400 of the largest stakeholders of pension funds, property owners, property managers, actually managed out of the Netherlands. So GRESBE.com, where you can see how those issues are being incorporated into the built environment.
Okay. Ryan Seitz, Scion. I'm not sure that, you know, carbon accounting is really the way to go necessarily, because you get the unintended consequences of, you know, behavior that aren't necessarily desirable in the future. I know I'm from the Seattle area. The Seattle system now is charging people for having plastic bags. So everybody's going to be basically using fabric bags and to get their groceries, or the recycling efforts turn out to be more costly than beneficial. So is there a thought to really look at that as to what the first, second, third, fourth order consequences of energy use as opposed to carbon use are?
Well, hopefully full carbon accounting does in fact look at those, but when I talk about sort of wanting to rate and assess a new building or an existing building operations, paper, plastic really doesn't come into the equation. A more interesting one that comes in is the hand drying in the restrooms, right? So I've heard all these arguments from the paper guys that paper is actually better in the long run. You hear all the arguments from the noisy air dryers that that's better, except you see all the water on the floor right below it. So, you know, we're going to go around and around about that, but, you know, I think there are some sort of sledgehammer impacts that, you know, right now we're still cutting butter with a chainsaw. You know, it gets the job done, but it's kind of messy and inefficient. So you have to accept that that's the current state of rating system development. Ted.
Yeah, I just want to quickly address Robert's comments on I'm Ted with DPR Construction. I'll be speaking a little later today. Relative to the notion of carbon accounting, the first measure really is just keeping track of it, getting some sense, because I've always been an advocate that the carbon accounting or the carbon footprint of a project doesn't start when we hand the keys over to the client. It starts when we start the design phase. We start flying back and forth across the country to look at design options, and we're working with an EU architect and a local Bay Area contractor, and designers are all over the place. So certainly virtual go-to, things of that sort of helped that process, but every subcontractor that I have on a project is in part and parcel part of that carbon footprint. There's a city's worth of carbon that are being generated for 18 months while we build a big structure. So looking at that into, not the finite level, but just the broad sense of procurement decisions, if it's a train unit that's constructed in one part of the country versus another unit constructed somewhere else, if I've started to put a fictitious carbon tax on what that decision might look like, just to have the discussion with the client, that we may make a decision to purchase something in Southern California for a Bay Area-based procurement versus Nutley, New Jersey, as an example. So just looking at the amount of impact relative to that. It's really hard to generate, and frankly, it doesn't end up making a lot of different decisions right now because it's the appetite by which the company wants to make those decisions. But Patagonia and Cliff Bar make a different decision than somebody else, perhaps. So, thanks.
So yeah, just the comment on value engineering often degrades value and involves no engineering. It's just cost cutting. And that's because we're in a lowest first cost economy, mostly for buildings. That's the way things go, and we just have to deal with it. Is there a question in back?
Yeah.
Gentleman over there.
You mentioned a 3% market penetration for, a 3% market share for any kind of certification. I assume that was the installed base. Is there a more optimistic number of people who are looking at any kind of certification for new construction? What's that number come to?
Well, that's specifically on the LEED system, which is the market leader at this point.
And is that new construction or the installed base?
That's the total installed base.
So new construction?
So what we're seeing in new construction these days is somewhere between 15 and 20% market share for rating and certification. But if you think about it, why are 80% of the owners deciding not to do it? What's wrong with the picture? And it's always around cost. It's the actual cost versus perceived benefit. And the problem in our decision-making, not a problem, but the fact of our decision-making, cost is real and immediate. I get to write a check to you. You're very happy. I'm less happy. Benefit is perceived and in the future. And our human decision-making is we'll pay 3 times as much to avoid pain as to secure gain, right? So if I don't see an ROI of 3 to 1 on my cost for certification versus real benefit, I'm not going to do it. Because after all, why should I give away my money to someone that says that I'm going to tell you you're a good guy? I already know that. And so what's happened is in the industry is people say, well, I'm designing to meet the standards, but I won't bother to certify. And so that's missing the C letter commitment, because we know the building process is really messy. And what is on the plans ain't necessarily what gets built. In fact, most buildings don't even have money for as-builts. They don't even know at the end what got built, except they got a pile of submittal requests and requests for information and original plans. And then you go in 2 years, 5 years later, you're redoing a lot of systems. So this is a messy business, and we need some tools that sort of help it make less messy.
Yep.
Next.
Heather.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey there.
Good job. I had one comment and a question. What you're talking about is externalizing the cost. You can do that with money. You can do it with other measurements, carbon accounting or any kind of accounting, and that's what we get into when we're gaming the system. Second one, you made a remark somewhere in this, wonder if you could elaborate on it, talking about the marketplace of responsible operators. Who'd you have in mind, and is there some definition of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the real estate industry, you will find operators like one of your good Texas companies, Gerald Hines Company out of Houston, that pride themselves on energy efficient operations. Hines himself is in his 80s now. He's a mechanical engineer by training and always wanted to have good systems, because if you're going to hold your real estate for a while, you don't want to have to keep fixing things. So do it right the first time, right? So there are a whole lot of operators who are heavily financed by pension funds, who themselves have sustainability as key goals for investments, who you could say are in the top echelon of sustainable building operators. They take it seriously, they invest money in that, they track it. Marks and Spencer in the UK is another operator that has at least made commitments to sustainable operations. So my comment was, let's take a group of those people, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, whatever the number is. Let's go to them and say, well, what do you consider to be the key performance indicators for sustainability? And now I'll craft a rating system that just has that in it, and not all the other things that the NGOs and all the activists think have to be in the system. But just what you want to measure on a regular basis, I want a rating system that deals with that, because then I know you're going to use it, because it's going to help you operate more efficiently in those parameters. Right now, they're not using the system enough to justify continuing to promote it, in my view. So I'm looking to create an alternative system that addresses KPIs for sustainability and gets us farther down the track, because lots more people are using the system than the current approach.
So, Jerry, one of the interesting things that is that whenever we have a discussion about carbon accounting, we end up talking about a lot of very fine little things that have one-time impact of small amounts, because we're trying to really get a handle on absolutely everything all at once. And this goes to Don's question here about the energy source. There are things that we know about electrical power, and we know where the building is going to be, and we know who their choices of power companies could potentially be, and we know what the footprints are for each of those. So we can go and say, it's going to be one of these maps. And then there are things that we do over and over and over and over and over again, hundreds or millions or tens of millions of times, and those little tiny impacts add up over time. But too often we're talking about small things with very few occurrences and ignoring too much of the very big things that we have monstrous impact. I was at a presentation, and I can't remember the context for it, but the top 50 ships, container ships, put out more carbon than all the cars in the US combined.
I'm not sure I really believe that.
Well, part of the reason for that is because they use very, very heavy fuel. And they're using it in a place where there's very little regulation, and efficiency is more economic than environmental. The point is, what you're doing, I think, is quite important. We need to pay attention, but we need to pay attention to the big rocks first, and less attention to the points and the bennies.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. You can actually do the calculation. Just the average U.S. commute each direction to office is about 12 miles. And you can actually do a calculation based on current fleet standards that you use more energy getting to and from work on a per square foot basis or per occupant basis than you actually do in the building itself. So now you could say that's today's world, but as people move towards telecommuting and other sort of remote work systems, that number will diminish. But it points out that urban design and not the building itself is one of the key determinants. And so in many respects, we're in the position of a drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost, not because that's where he lost them, but because that's where the only light is. So.
Jerry, at risk of taking it back to the discussion about KPIs, because I know carbon, it seems like everyone's fired up about carbon and the sort today, but I just wanted to mention that if you think back to 2000, if we had to put the obligation or the opportunity in front of Fortune 500 to come up with a rating system or some form of qualification of buildings, we'd still be talking about it. I don't think that would have happened.
You're absolutely
2000.
right.
So I think that what we're really talking about now is back to progress that we talked about earlier, about things are moving forward, and now the notion of refinement of the opportunity now includes the Fortune 100s that have dramatic opinion about how best to service not just their portfolio of buildings, but what's best for their employees, healthy buildings, all that sort of stuff that goes along with that. So I think you're bringing up this question at an appropriate time and place of the scale of what our influence and opportunity has been, and in part and parcel because of software that's allowed to help with that, but also just the desire for folks to dig deeper on it now that they can get their hands around it.
Well, Ted, I think my real point is that it's time to press the reset button on the whole notion that a small group of people are going to change the building industry all by themselves without really being fully integrated with how buildings are actually designed, built, operated, and managed. That we've gone as far as we can go down that track. Now it's time to really rethink the whole approach, and that certainly is not the approach taken by the current market leader, which is, as you suggest, is just about refinements. But if you actually look at the next version of LEED for existing building operation and management, there's 12 prerequisites you got to do before you can even get rated in the system that themselves have a huge cost. So I'm going to tell you how green you are, but by the way, you got to spend all this money up front that you don't think is necessary to spend in order to get my rating. That seems to me to be off the point. It's like, well, what do you think is important? Not what do I think is important. So that's why I think that system ultimately cannot work, cannot reach the broad range of the building industry. Well, that's why you have competitors in an industry, right? You know, to come up with different ideas. So that's kind of direction I'd like to see things go. And I'm here at this conference, thanks to Paul's invitation, but hopefully the people on the software side of things will see an opportunity here to work with rating agencies and standards development organizations like ours to come up with a different approach.
Two thoughts. One is that if these are push type systems and they're only getting 3% ratings across the spectrum, but then you pointed out that there's quite a lot of buildings that are following along, so that the push part is actually working.
Some has worked for sure, but the rate of growth has stopped. In fact, you might say for the engineers here, the second derivative of growth is negative. So we're now seeing that we've peaked. There's definitely been an influence. The world's a better place because of this. But now, what's the next step? What's in the evolution?
Right, and it seems to me that part of the trigger for that is that the reason you go for a lead rating is that you're making yourself special in some way, that you're able to sell a higher building price, rent for higher rates, so on and so forth. If you have a higher number of people that are getting certified, or a higher percentage of the building that are getting certified, you're no longer special enough to actually make it worth going through the process the way that it is so expensive. So it's almost like, I think what you're asking for is a different driver function for the reasoning and putting the responsibility.
I mean, if you're a for-lease office developer in a downtown of a major city, you're going to get a lead rating because the brokers are asking for it, the tenants are asking for it. That's a no-brainer. But if I'm developing a 50,000 square foot commercial office outside of the periphery of a major city, I don't get much market benefit, but I incur the full cost. And it's always going to be cost versus benefit. And so until we really convince people that this has real benefit in design savings, in operating cost savings, it's going to be a hard sell.